Slavery, the state of being the property of another human being without rights or freedom and forced to engage in service to their owner. Slavery is almost as old as human civilization. Almost every major culture at every point in history has practiced it in some form. Today it is illegal slavery. The state of being the property of another human being without rights or freedom and forced to engage in service to their owner. Slavery is almost as old as human civilization. Almost every major culture at every point in history has practiced it in some form. Today it is illegal in every country and is understood as one of the worst atrocities in human history. When most people imagine slavery, they think of black slaves in the American South, stolen from their homes and condemned to servitude for the rest of their lives and their children. Slavery has had many other forms too. Slave soldiers, sexual slavery, domestic slavery, galley slaves, and more. Each conjures up images of harsh masters and powerful empires squeezing the weak for all they worth. That might fit your view of the American South or Rome, but it probably doesn't fit your view of Native Americans. The popular image of the Native Americans as perfect, peace-living people leaves no room for something as awful as slavery, except when they were forced into it by invading Europeans. But the truth is much darker. Like any human beings, Native Americans were more than capable of enslaving other people. From Alaska to the Andes, they invented slave systems of their own before Europeans arrived and continued to practice it long afterwards. Native Americans could enslave the old and the young, the native and non-native, the black and the white, and history has mostly forgotten it. In this video, we will explore the dark history of slavery by Native Americans. An easy place to begin is with the great pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas. The Maya of Central America practiced slavery for centuries. Maya slavery was a lot like slavery in older world societies. Most slaves were captives taken from enemy societies in war or criminals condemned to slavery for crimes such as theft. Slaves acted as domestic servants or manual laborers for their masters or were traded in exchange for valuable goods. The children of slaves usually weren't considered slaves automatically, but orphans in Maya society often were. However, these orphan slaves could expect to be released from slavery when they grew up and re-entered society. However, Maya slaves also faced the risk of being sacrificed in religious rituals. For many war captives, slavery was just the waiting period before they were sacrificed by their victorious enemy. When Maya rituals called for a sacrifice from a powerful noble family, it was common for that family to buy a slave to be sacrificed as a substitute. Slaves in the Aztec Empire of Mexico were similar. Every ruler and noble owned slaves to serve their every whim, and many of these slaves met their end under the obsidian knife of a chanting priest. Because of the importance of slave sacrifices to Aztec religion, slave traders were among the richest and most respected merchants in Aztec society. In Peru, the Inca practiced a system of forced labor known as mata. Under the mita system, the Inca state claimed a right to their subjects' labor for a portion of the year. These mita laborers were forced to abandon their homes and families, sometimes for months at a time, to work on imperial building projects like roads, grain storehouses, and royal palaces. They would also farm the royal estates, raise the royal herds, and work the royal potteries. Ma was even used to fill the Inca armies for their endless campaigns of conquest and the suppression of internal rebellions. The people had no choice in this, but the state did provide them food, clothes, and shelter for the duration of their term, and they would be released from service after a few months. Since the Inca did not have a money-based economy, the mita also functioned as the main form of taxation, allowing the Inca to extract value from the people they ruled. Meta wasn't the same as later cattle slavery, but it would meet modern definitions of slavery. Slavery in pre-Columbian North America is harder to find. The lack of written sources and the small number of permanent settlements or cities means that evidence for most things before Europeans arrived isn't as easy to find as it is for the Maya or Inca. Slavery has always been more common in settled or urban societies with large populations and easy access to others who can be enslaved in large numbers. Most pre-Columbian North Americans, however, were nomadic or semi-nomadic, living in small groups with infrequent contact with outsiders. The city of Cahokia on the Mississippi was the largest city north of Mexico until the Europeans arrived, thriving between 1050 and 1350. And even here, slavery may have existed. Archaeologists have found human remains whose burials suggest social inferiority and possibly sacrifice that may belong to slaves. For most people, the story of slavery in North America begins with Europeans. The Spanish immediately enslaved the Taino people of the Caribbean. When they arrived in Mexico, they adapted and reformed existing slavery to serve their own interests. For example, the Inca meter was reworked to provide slave labor for Spanish gold mines. But with massive native population decline due to conquest and disease, they resorted to importing vast numbers of African slaves. The British, French, Portuguese, and Dutch did the same in their American colonies, thus bringing it to North America. The first black African slave to arrive in the future territory of the United States landed in Virginia in 1619. Over the following years, slavery expanded hand in hand with white settlement, especially in the American South, where slave labor powered industries like tobacco and cotton. This slavery was different to what existed in most of the Americas before. Black slaves were chat slaves. They were born slaves with few opportunities to escape it. Their children would inherit the same status, and slavery had a strong racial element where the color of one's skin marked them out as a slave regardless of anything else. The Native American response to the introduction of cattle slavery varied. Some groups embraced it, others had no use for it. But as we'll see, some already knew slavery very well. The Indians of the Northeast almost certainly had a form of slavery before Europeans arrived. The best known are the Iroquois, made up of 5, later 6 tribes bound together by a great law of peace. The Iroquois typically lived in settled villages organized around long houses. They farmed their land and conducted coordinated warfare against rival groups, which created the conditions for a slave system. These Iroquois practiced a unique form of conflict known as mourning wars. Whenever a member of the tribe was killed by an enemy, the Iroquois would conduct a mourning war to capture one of the offending tribe and keep them as a slave. These slaves were taken by force before being delivered to the family of the deceased who prompted the mourning war in the first place. Slaves among the Iroquois were vulnerable to torture and abuse. By default, they were considered less than human. Most Iroquois words for slave are also the word for dog or pet, and the act of capturing a slave used the same words as that of taming a wild animal. It was common for new captives to be mutilated, which demoralized them and marked them out as slaves. White American slaves did similar things with branding, and Arab slave traders usually castrated their male slaves for similar reasons. The Iroquois were fond of cutting off a finger or two, which may have been a way to ensure the slaves couldn't draw a bow to fight their captives. Slaves among the Iroquois would be expected to perform the tasks previously done by the deceased tribe member, whose death prompted the mourning war. For an agricultural society like the Iroquois, this usually meant physical labor. Depending on the captives and the good behavior of the slave, some slaves could be adopted fully into the tribe. This adoption could mean many things. In some cases, captives were adopted into Iroquois society on equal terms, with some Iroquois slaves rising to become respected members of society. In others, they were still treated as slaves, condemned to serve their new masters against their wishes, facing punishment and death for disobedience. Iroquois slavery and mourning wars were already happening when European contact was made in the 16th century. European observers offered many accounts of these mourning wars and the slaves they produced throughout the following century or two. It should be noted, though, that the Iroquois rarely, if ever, traded these slaves to the whites, and it was just as rare for the Iroquois to purchase black slaves from the whites. Iroquois slavery was mostly self-contained. Population decline and loss of land led to the gradual disappearance of this system. As Iroquois numbers dwindled, and as white settlers destroyed or displaced the other communities that the Iroquois would raid for their slaves, Iroquois slavery was no longer viable. Out west, the Plains Indians lived a different nomadic life among wandering kinship groups that left little room for conventional slavery. Different groups of Plains Indians would fight one another for land and resources, and did take captives who we might consider to be slaves. With the introduction of horses to the plains following European colonization, many groups adopted an aggressive raiding culture that led to direct participation in slave trading as well. Groups like the Apache and Comanche in the southern plains first became involved in the slave trade through the Spanish. The Spanish in New Mexico and Texas always wanted slave labor for their colonies, while the Plains Indians wanted horses and guns for their raids. Plains Indians became a useful source of slaves for the Spanish in more ways than one. The Comanche would capture the Apache to sell into slavery and vice versa. This practice continued when America took over the region and only stopped with abolition. Sometimes, though, the Plains Indians would keep captives for themselves. The men of defeated tribes were usually killed, but the women and children might not be. These captives might become camp slaves, performing essential chores like cleaning, cooking, and maintenance while the men fought or hunted, and the women supervised them. Children could be adopted into the tribe, but their existence was still dangerous. The famous Shoshan explorer, Sacagawea was a victim of a Hide raid as a child and spent several years as a slave to the group before being sold off. She eventually ended up being sold to a white owner who took her with him when he was recruited to the Louisville and Clark expedition in 1803, where Sacagawea earned her place in history. Even whites could be enslaved by Plains Indians. A famous example occurred in 1836 when Comanche Indians attacked Fort Parker in Texas, taking 5 of the whites as slaves. One of these was Rebecca Plummer Parker, who spent the next 2 years a slave to the Comanche, where she faced physical and sexual abuse. Parker's infant son was also captured, and she was pregnant with another when the Comanche took her. Parker's first son was taken away and killed early in her captivity. The second was born while she was still a slave. But when the Comanche realized the newborn would interfere too much with her slave duties, they murdered the child in front of her. Parker was eventually bought by passing traders and freed, but she died shortly after from the effects of her time as a slave. Not every Comanche slave faced the same treatment. One of the other Fort Parker captives, Cynthia Ann Park, was no older than 11. Initially, she was treated like a slave, but in time she was adopted into the Comanche tribe. She married a Comanche man and had children who were also accepted as full Comanche. One of her children, Quanah Parker, rose to become a famous Comanche leader and the last free chief of the Comanche nation. But when it comes to slavery, it's the American South where it is easiest to find. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and the Sina were known as the 5 civilized tribes for their adoption of white culture, dress, and political organization. Most gave up their pre-colonial nomadic lives and settled down on farms, villages, and plantations of their own. Among the things they also adopted enthusiastically was slavery. Members of the 5 tribes actively participated in plantation slavery across the American South, with thousands of them owning tens of thousands of black slaves. They produced tobacco, cotton, sugar, and other goods much like the white slaveholders did. The pattern of ownership was similar to that of white slavers. Most slaves were concentrated on the vast estates of exceptionally wealthy landowners who used the slaves to work the land. Smaller slaveholders might own a handful of slaves to work on smaller plots of land or to act as house slaves for their family or business. Also, like white slave owners, the 5 civilized tribes adopted racist views to justify their slavery. In the racial hierarchy of colonial America, Native Americans were seen as inferior to whites, but blacks were inferior to both. Slavery allowed Indian slave owners to feel superior. For example, the Cherokee Constitution of 1827 declared that anyone descended from a black ancestor was excluded from membership of the Cherokee Nation. This racial hierarchy remained in place even when Indians were being victimized by it. This was obvious during the Trail of Tears between 1830 and 1850, when almost 50,000 members of the 5 civilized tribes, mostly Cherokee, were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in the southeast and forced west across the Mississippi. The Trail of Tears was an atrocity in itself that claimed thousands of lives, but easily forgotten were the black slaves of these deported Indians. Both the US and Indians considered these slaves to be Indian property to be removed with everything else. Even the Cherokee principal, Chief John Ross, brought his slaves with him on the trail. Around 10 to 15% of those who walked the Trail of Tears were black slaves. To the slaves, it didn't really matter whether masters were white or Indian. Enslavement by either was miserable. In 1842, the Cherokee faced the consequences of their slaveholding. When dozens of slaves in modern-day Oklahoma rebelled and escaped their plantations, these slaves acquired weapons and killed the first slave catcher sent after them, until a force of 100 Cherokee militiamen caught them and returned them to captivity. The Cherokee ordered the leaders of the revolt to be executed and expelled every non-enslaved black person from Cherokee territory. Support for slavery and their past mistreatment by the US government persuaded the 5 civilized tribes to declare their support for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Thousands of them served as soldiers and scouts for the Confederacy in direct opposition to abolition. When the Confederacy was finally defeated in 1865, slavery wasn't automatically abolished for the 5 civilized tribes, since they were not technically part of the United States. Nevertheless, the US pressured them, and by the end of 1866, all 5 tribes had agreed to abolition and were forced to accept newly freed slaves into their society, in a legal sense at least. Still, slavery left its mark. Newly freed blacks were heavily discriminated against in most of the societies, but slavery was complicated, and some slaves reflected that Indian masters were generally kinder than white ones. Eliza Whittam, who was a black slave owned by a Cherokee master, endured the Trail of Tears at 5 years old and spent many years as a slave working cotton for her owner. She lived to be over 100 and gave an interview in 1935 where she admitted that she'd enjoyed her time under the Cherokee. "I can't say that I have been any happier and contented since I was free than I was in those good old days. Whether this was a fair opinion or the effect of Stockholm Syndrome is up for debate. One last visit should be paid to the Pacific Northwest. Europeans didn't make contact with them until the 1770s, and what they found was shocking. A society of hunter-gatherers who, thanks to the abundant fish and other food sources in the region, had the food security and dense population of an agricultural society where people gather in large enough numbers. Slavery is rarely far behind. In these conditions allowed the indigenous Northwesterners to be some of the most prolific slavers ever seen in the Americas. Slavery in the Northwest had all the hallmarks of slavery elsewhere. Slaves were pure property with no rights of their own who could be killed on a whim. Uniquely among indigenous-created slavery, slavery was hereditary, and children of slaves were automatically slaves as well. Slaves were rarely freed or adopted into the tribe. Among groups like the Haida of Alaska, as much as 25% of the population was slaves. War and raiding were the main sources of slaves, as different groups in the regions waged constant conflict against one another. Slaves provided essential labor, but also served as status symbols and proof of wealth. Aside from their totem poles, the indigenous people of the Northwest are best known for their potlatches, which could also be steeped in slavery. Potlatches were charitable festivals where hosts invited guests to celebrate and showered gifts upon them, usually to display the host's wealth. Naturally, slaves were a common gift from the wealthiest Northwesterners. It wasn't uncommon for festival goers to head home with a new slave, courtesy of a particularly wealthy host. Scholars believe Northwest slavery might be some of the oldest slavery on the continent, dating back almost 2,000 years. It was also among the last slavery to be abolished in the Americas. It was still being practiced when the US bought Alaska from Russia in 1867, and American officials complained for years that they were unable to stamp it out. Reports of it continued into the 1870s and 1880s, with some reports of slavery still existing into the 20th century in some villages. Admitting that Native Americans had slavery isn't to paint them as evil or purely as oppressors. Native Americans were the primary victim of Native American slavery, and they were also heavily victimized by European slavery too. Recognizing Native American slavery is to place them alongside every other human society. They were just as flawed and complicated as people from anywhere else in the world, and are deserving of the same respect and criticism offered to every society. Native American slavery is just another piece of a history that is just as complicated and worthy of study as any other. Their flaws shouldn't be forgotten any more than their strengths.